I knew something was off the moment I saw the envelope taped to my front door. Not in the mailbox taped. Sloppy handwriting, aggressive underlining. That was classic Zelda Everman, the HOA's self-appointed queen and professional pain in everyone's rear. I peeled it off and read the fine print. Literally, violation, excessive number of pets residing at property, fine $1,000. I stood there on my porch, my coffee going cold in my hand, stunned. I had 4 dogs, yes, but they weren't pets. They were service dogs in training. I run a small program, unpaid, that prepares dogs for disabled veterans. My brother lost both legs in Afghanistan, so yeah, it's personal. I walked back inside, the dogs trotting behind me, quiet, respectful, better behaved than half the HOA board. I glanced around the living room, crates clean. No barking, no mess. Just 4 Labrador retrievers lying calmly in their designated corners like they had been trained to do. I called the number listed on the notice, straight to voicemail. 2 hours later, Zelda herself showed up at my front door, clipboard in hand like she was ready to issue parking tickets in a war zone. "Mr. Wallace Harlan," she said, adjusting her oversized sunglasses even though it was cloudy. "You've exceeded the 2-pet limit. That's clearly stated in the community bylaws. They're not pets. They're service animals in training," I said, keeping my tone level. "There's a federal exemption for that, HOA guidelines." Zelda blinked, clearly not expecting me to be anything other than apologetic. "Well, we're a private community. The HOA rules don't override federal law," I cut in. "You're welcome to look it up," she huffed. Literally. Then she took a step closer and peered into my living room window like she had a badge and a warrant. "They look like regular dogs to me," she said, arms crossed. "They're not. And unless you're a federal inspector, you don't get to decide what a service dog looks like." That's when she pulled out her phone and started snapping photos of my house, my truck, even the training vests hanging by the door. I asked her to stop. She didn't, so I pulled out my phone and started recording her. "Zelda, you're trespassing," I said. "You're harassing me and taking unauthorized photos on private property." She turned red, but she didn't stop. "I'm documenting a violation. You'll be hearing from the board." "Oh, I'm counting on it," I said, smiling not because I was happy, but because I knew exactly what my next move was. I'd dealt with bullies before. And the thing about bullies? They hate paperwork, facts, and the law. Too bad for Zelda. I love all three. 3 days after Zelda's impromptu photo shoot, a certified letter arrived. Thick envelope, gold HOA seal. They weren't playing around. Inside, a formal notice from the board, signed by their attorney, demanding immediate compliance with the 2-pet rule under threat of daily fines. They'd tacked on an additional $500 for non-cooperation with HOA inspection procedures. I read it twice, then set it down on the kitchen table, next to a copy of the Fair Housing Act and a thick binder labeled HOA Compliance Service Animals. I'd started the binder after my second dog training class, just in case someone like Zelda came sniffing around. The next morning, I called a friend of mine, Kendra, a civil rights attorney who used to work with the state's Housing and Urban Development Department. We met over coffee and I laid everything out. "They're trying to fine you out of the program," she said, flipping through the letter. "This is more than overreach. It's targeted harassment." She tapped her pen on the phrase unauthorized animal occupation. "They're pretending service dog trainees are unauthorized animals and hoping you'll either pay up or move out. They've got a lawyer backing them," I said. She looked unimpressed. "So do you now." Kendra drafted a cease and desist the same day, citing multiple violations of federal housing laws. She included the HOA Title Roman II and Roman III provisions as well as the Fair Housing Amendments Act. But she didn't stop there. She attached my state certified training credentials, a summary of the program's nonprofit status, and a list of recent graduate service dogs now placed with disabled veterans in 3 different states. We sent it by courier to the HOA's legal representative and copied every member of the board. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The next weekend, I came home from picking up training supplies to find a bright orange sticker slapped across my garage door. Notice of enforcement, non-compliant occupancy. It looked official until I peeled it off and realized it had been printed on a standard office printer with a fake watermark. There was also a fresh notice taped to my utility box. The HOA was threatening to restrict my access to community resources, including waste collection and water service. That's when I called the county. A zoning inspector came by the following afternoon. He walked the property with a clipboard, took measurements, inspected the kennels, and reviewed my permits. "You're not doing anything wrong," he said, straightening his hat. "They don't have the authority to interfere with your utilities. That's a public service." He took photos of the fake sticker and the blocked utility access notice and promised to file a report. 2 days later, I received a summons to appear before the HOA's disciplinary committee. Zelda had escalated things again, this time accusing me of operating a commercial enterprise within a residential zone. I showed up to the hearing in a pressed shirt and tie, binder under one arm, Kendra beside me with her briefcase. The board sat behind a folding table like they were a tribunal. Zelda was dead center, flanked by 2 smug-looking board members I barely recognized. She started in immediately. "Mr. Harlan has continued to ignore repeated notices and warnings. He's operating a dog training business that brings traffic, noise, and unsanitary conditions to our neighborhood." Kendra stood before I could respond. "There are no clients, no on-site transactions, and no advertisements. This is a federally protected activity. The dogs are here temporarily while they're trained for medical assistance." Zelda interrupted, tapping her gavel on the table. "Excuse me, you're not on the agenda." "I'm his legal counsel," Kendra said calmly. "And I'm well within my rights to be here." Zelda's jaw clenched so tight I thought she might crack a molar. One of the other board members cleared his throat and gestured to a stack of papers. "We've had several complaints from nearby residents about barking and aggressive behavior." Kendra didn't miss a beat. "We've collected surveillance footage and witness testimony from every adjacent property owner. None of them made complaints. In fact, 3 of them submitted written statements praising Mr. Harlan's quiet, respectful program." I opened my binder and handed over the signed statements. Zelda reached for them but hesitated when she saw the notary stamp on each one. I leaned forward. "You're inventing complaints." "That's fraud," Kendra added. "And if you continue attempting to fine, harass, or limit his access to basic utilities, we'll file a formal complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development." Another board member, a man in his 50s with thinning hair and a nervous smile, broke the silence. "Maybe we should table this," he said cautiously. "Until we've, reviewed the legals." Zelda cut him off. "No, this has gone on long enough. If Mr. Harlan won't comply, we'll begin lien proceedings." Kendra raised her eyebrows. "You're threatening to seize property over a lawful, protected activity?" Zelda didn't blink. "It's in our charter." Kendra pulled out her tablet, opened a document, and read aloud. "No HOA bylaw shall contradict or override federal law, including but not limited to the Fair Housing Act and ADER regulations." "You wrote that into your own charter, Mrs. Everman." Zelda turned pale. We left the hearing with no resolution, but the silence afterward was telling. No more letters. No more stickers, for about a week. Then it got worse. I came home one night to find my rear fence gate swinging open. One of the dogs, a golden retriever named Scout, was missing. Panic didn't even begin to cover it. I jumped in my truck and tore through the neighborhood calling his name. I found him 2 blocks down, cornered behind a trash bin, shaking. Someone had cut through his training vest with a box cutter. I called the police. An officer arrived within 20 minutes. He took photos, dusted the gate for prints, and logged the damaged vest into evidence. I showed him the footage from my security camera installed a month earlier. It caught a shadowy figure slipping around the side of the house and unlatching the gate. He nodded grimly. "That's criminal trespass, possibly animal endangerment." He asked if I had any suspects. I didn't have proof, but I gave him the name that had become too familiar. Less than 48 hours later, police executed a search warrant at Zelda's home. They found a stack of HOA documents, a pair of bolt cutters, and one of Scout's missing ID tags in a drawer. She was arrested on the spot for evidence tampering and trespass. The story hit the local news within the day. The headline: HOA president arrested for targeting disabled veterans service dog program. The fallout was immediate. By the end of the week, 3 board members resigned. The county launched a formal investigation into the HOA's practices, and a recall vote was scheduled. Neighbors began stopping by not to complain, but to apologize. Several offered to volunteer with the program. A retired couple down the street even donated a stack of brand new training toys and leashes. I installed a second camera system, just to be safe. Zelda was charged and released pending trial. Her attorney tried to claim it was all a misunderstanding. No one bought it, the best part. Kendra filed a civil suit on my behalf for harassment, property damage, and emotional distress. The HOA's insurance company settled within a month. They cut me a check for $25,000. Scout recovered fully, and within 2 months, he was placed with a double amputee Marine in Colorado. I got a handwritten letter from the vet's daughter, thanking me for giving her dad his independence back. You can't put a price on that. But you can sure as hell make people pay when they mess with it. The trial date for Zelda's criminal charges hadn't even been set yet when a new face showed up at a community meeting: Ken Alston, introduced as the interim compliance liaison. A former city planner turned HOA consultant, he was brought in by the remaining board members under the guise of restoring order and transparency. From the start, I didn't like the guy. Ken wore wire-rimmed glasses he didn't need and spoke like he was giving a TED talk on municipal landscaping. But what set off alarms wasn't his tone, it was how quickly he started drafting new, provisional amendments to the HOA charter. The first one: a clause banning all animal-related activity on any property not zoned for commercial use, regardless of federal exemptions, pending board approval. I read it 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because I couldn't believe how brazen it was. It was a direct shot at me, dressed up in bureaucratic language. I brought the amendment to Kendra. "They're trying to sneak this in as a zoning issue," she said, flipping through the packet. "But zoning's handled at the city level. This is smoke and mirrors." "So what's the move?" She pointed to the signature line at the end of the proposal. "They need a 2/3 majority from the homeowners to pass it. That's your opening." For the next 2 weeks, I walked door to door, not in protest, not to argue, just to talk. I brought flyers detailing the real purpose of the amendment and a list of legal citations proving it wouldn't hold up under city code. What surprised me wasn't the support, it was the stories I heard. A single mother 2 blocks over had been fined for improper window coverings because her curtains were patterned. A retired couple had been threatened with legal action for hanging wind chimes. A local EMT had been told to remove the ambulance decal from his own vehicle because it clashed with the community's aesthetic. By the time the vote came around, the amendment failed with less than 30% approval. Ken didn't say a word during the announcement. He just collected his folders and left the clubhouse without looking up. But the board wasn't done. Weeks later, I received a notice from the city's Code Enforcement Division. It claimed a formal complaint had been filed alleging that my property was operating as an unlicensed training facility, and that I was housing animals in excess of the allowable limit for residential zones. Kendra filed a Freedom of Information Act request. The complaint had been submitted anonymously, but we traced it back thanks to a city clerk who'd recognized the name on the envelope. Ken Alston. That was the final straw. We weren't dealing with ignorance anymore. This was targeted sabotage. Kendra contacted the City Ethics Commission. Within a week, the city launched an internal review of every complaint Ken had filed in the last 2 years across 4 neighborhoods. Turns out, I wasn't the only person he'd tried to shut down. In one case, he'd used a forged city planner's signature to push through a parking restriction that blocked off access to a veteran's home care nurse. When the commission's findings went public, Ken was arrested for impersonating a city official and submitting fraudulent documents under municipal letterhead. He was charged with obstruction, misuse of public resources, and falsifying zoning reports. The fallout from that exploded. The HOA board scrambled to distance themselves. They claimed Ken had acted independently and without their knowledge, but emails told a different story. Kendra subpoenaed internal communications between Ken and Zelda dated before her arrest. One thread showed them discussing neutralizing Wallace's operation and strategically introducing nuisance ordinances. The board's liability insurance dropped them 2 days after the emails surfaced. By now, the community was done staying quiet. A group of residents, led by the EMT and a local small business owner, formed a petition to force a full special election to replace the board. They needed a minimum of 75 signatures. They got over 130 in 3 days. The special election was scheduled for the following month, but the mess wasn't over. While combing through the HOA's financial disclosures, prompted by a whistleblower on the board, a forensic accountant discovered that over $70,000 in legal expenses had been funneled through a shell entity registered to Zelda's cousin in another state. That money had been billed to residents as community litigation fees. The state attorney general's office took interest immediately. A grand jury was convened. Zelda was rearrested, this time on charges of wire fraud and embezzlement. Her cousin was indicted for conspiracy and money laundering. The remaining board members were subpoenaed. The community clubhouse was padlocked by court order for evidence preservation. I didn't attend the first day of the grand jury hearing. I was across town, attending a placement ceremony for one of our dogs, a black lab named Tanner. He'd been assigned to a retired firefighter with severe PTSD. Watching that man kneel down and let Tanner rest his head on his knee was the kind of victory no courtroom could offer, but I showed up to the second day. I was called as a witness. I testified about the harassment, the forged complaints, the fear tactics, and the retaliation. I submitted recordings, emails, notarized statements, and camera footage. The jury leaned in. They weren't just listening, they were absorbing. Afterward, the prosecutor shook my hand and said, "You didn't just bring evidence, you brought receipts." By then, the neighborhood had changed. The people who used to wave politely from a distance now stopped to chat. Kids who used to walk their dogs on the opposite sidewalk now came right up to the gate to ask about the pups in training. A barbecue was organized by the very residents who once kept their distance. They even made a banner. "Welcome back, Wallace. I didn't want recognition. I wanted peace." But peace, it turns out, sometimes comes after a storm that clears out everything rotten. At the special election, every board seat was replaced. The new president was the retired firefighter's wife. She ran unopposed. One of the first motions passed was the establishment of a community oversight committee, residents with legal, civic, and educational backgrounds tasked with reviewing every past HOA decision from the last 5 years. I was offered a position on the committee. I accepted with one condition, that we create a permanent exemption for service animal training, clearly written into the community charter, not hidden in the margins or buried in legalese. They voted it in unanimously. The program grew. With the settlement money, I added an extra kennel, a shaded training area, and a modest indoor classroom. A local high school even partnered with us for a new community service program. Students helped train the dogs under supervision, logging hours toward graduation while learning about responsibility, empathy, and discipline. Not long after, I got a letter from a veteran in Arizona who'd received one of our dogs. He didn't write much, just a few lines. but they landed like a punch to the heart. He said he hadn't left his house in over a year until he met his dog. That now he walked his daughter to school. That for the first time in a long time he felt like a father again. You don't fight HOA corruption because it's fun. You fight it because it's necessary. Because behind every rule twisted into a weapon, there's a real person being hit with it. And sometimes, it takes a few good dogs and a few better neighbors to remind a community who it really belongs to. The first sign something was wrong came on a Thursday morning when I opened the program's mail and found a letter from the IRS. It wasn't addressed to me personally, but to the nonprofit Our Little Service Dog Training Program. It claimed we hadn't filed proper documentation to maintain our tax-exempt status and were now under review for suspected fraud. I stared at it, stunned. The filing had gone through months ago. I remembered because I'd sat in my garage at midnight with a laptop and a mug of reheated coffee, double-checking every line before mailing a hard copy and submitting the online version. I called the nonprofit hotline. The rep confirmed what I suspected. Their system showed no record of our submission. I asked whether it was possible the documents had been intercepted or removed. She hesitated. Then said, "Only if someone intentionally contacted us and requested an update to your file before proper verification procedures were followed." That night, I went back through the security footage from the week our documents had been sent. At the time, I dropped the envelope in the locked outgoing mailbox at the end of my driveway. Nothing unusual on camera until I saw a man in a reflective vest approach the mailbox 2 days later, unlock it with a key, and remove the contents. He wasn't a postal worker. I paused the footage, zoomed in, and recognized him immediately. It was the former board treasurer Norman Lyle. He'd resigned quietly during the financial audit, but apparently hadn't gone far. I brought the footage to the postmaster the next morning. Within 2 days, the Postal Inspection Service opened a federal case. Mail tampering was a serious offense. But it got worse. The investigators checked the logs for my outgoing mail and found a pattern: over a dozen pieces of correspondence flagged as delivered but never processed. All nonprofit related. All sent during the weeks leading up to the board's attempted amendment. The motive was clear. Sabotage the program's legal standing before the community vote. Federal agents coordinated with the county sheriff's office and obtained a warrant to search Norman's home. Inside, they found a locked filing cabinet containing shredded documents, a rubber mail key replica, and a flash drive. That drive held digital copies of every form I'd submitted, scanned and time-stamped proof they'd been intercepted deliberately. Norman was arrested for federal mail fraud and obstruction. The local news picked it up again, this time with a headline that drew more attention than any before. Former HOA treasurer accused of mail fraud in scheme against veteran service program. I didn't attend the arraignment. I was busy fitting a new Labrador pup with his harness, showing him how to navigate curbs with a tethered partner. But I did get a call from the assistant U.S. attorney assigned to the case. She wanted me to testify during the grand jury proceedings. It wasn't just about one man tampering with mail. It was about a coordinated effort to dismantle a federally protected operation for personal control and petty revenge, and they were building a conspiracy case. The testimony was intense. I was asked to recount not just the mail incident, but the entire pattern of interference from the fake enforcement notices to the unauthorized use of city letterhead and the attempt to rewrite community bylaws under false pretenses. I brought the evidence, the video footage, the notarized statements, the backup copies of all my nonprofit filings. I even handed over a photo of the shredded documents found in Norman's cabinet reconstructed by forensic techs to reveal my original EIN confirmation letter. The grand jury indicted not only Norman, but 2 former board members who had instructed him to monitor and manage any outgoing mail related to the program. The charges included conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of nonprofit operations, and unauthorized possession of federal property. The fallout was swift. The HOA's remaining leadership formally dissolved. The neighborhood voted to transition to a resident-led advisory council with no enforcement arm. All authority was handed over to a neutral property management company vetted and hired by the community itself. For the first time since I moved in, the neighborhood didn't feel like a battleground. But there was one last storm to weather. The state's Attorney General's office, already investigating Zelda's financial misconduct, widened the scope of their probe based on the grand jury indictment. Turns out, Norman and Zelda hadn't just targeted my program, they'd also attempted to reroute grant funds meant for a local disabled veterans fund into a private beautification initiative that never manifested. The grants were small, but the deception was clear. The AG filed civil charges against both of them for misuse of charitable funds and attempted misappropriation. A restitution order followed, requiring Zelda and Norman to repay every cent to the original veteran fund, plus interest. With the program's nonprofit status reinstated and the community finally on steady footing, I focused on rebuilding. I used the settlement money from the civil suit to invest in a mobile training unit, a retrofitted van with ramps, climate control, and space for up to 4 dogs at a time. It allowed me to visit clients who couldn't make it to the house, including a triple amputee in the next county who hadn't left his home in over a year. Around that time, a letter arrived from the Department of Veterans Affairs. They'd heard about the program through the grand jury proceedings and offered to list us as an approved training partner for independent service dog placements. That meant more visibility, more referrals, and a chance to expand. I hired an assistant Paige, a former Army medic who'd trained her own PTSD support dog. She brought structure, humor, and a level of grit that the dogs respected immediately. Under her guidance, we added advanced mobility training and scent detection for diabetic and seizure assistance. The neighborhood, once fractured, rallied around the program. Local teens helped build a sensory garden in the back lot for the dogs to work through distraction training. A retired electrician installed solar panels on the kennel roof at no cost. Every Saturday, a group of residents now gather for coffee and canines, where new pups meet the community and residents learn about service dog etiquette. It wasn't just about dogs anymore. It was about healing trust in each other, in institutions, in the idea that standing up against abuse doesn't have to be loud or angry. It just has to be relentless. One afternoon, I was sitting on the porch with Scout, now retired, and mine for good, watching a kid across the street walk his own dog in a tiny red vest. His mom waved. She was the same woman who once hesitated to even say hello. "You saved this place," Paige said, coming up the steps with 2 mugs of iced tea. I shook my head. "We did. Everyone who said enough and meant it." She looked down at Scout, then back at me. "Zelda's sentencing hearing is next week. You going?" "I'll be there," I said, "not for payback. Just to make sure the system sees what we saw." And I was. I sat in the back row of the courtroom, not to gloat, but to witness. Zelda stood silent as the judge read the charges: wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy to obstruct a federal nonprofit. She was sentenced to 6 years with no eligibility for early release. Norman received 4. The others took plea deals and were barred from holding any HOA or nonprofit leadership positions for life. Outside the courthouse, a reporter asked me if I felt vindicated. "No," I said. "I feel tired. But I also feel like I can finally get back to work." She asked what I'd tell others going through something similar: document everything, know your rights, and don't wait for someone else to fix it. With the sun finally dipping below the courthouse roof, I headed home. That night, as the new pups dozed in their kennels and the house settled into its usual rhythm, I updated the program's mission statement. It used to read, "Training service dogs for veterans." Now it said, "Training dogs, building independence. Protecting what matters." I turned off the lights, stepped into the quiet, and knew for the first time in a long time that this place was finally mine again.